Okay, so this mini lecture is going to go into a little bit more detail about temperament and how it's been studied and what the research findings show. So in the beginning of your chapter, emotional development in the first 3 years is discussed, and that's what happens in general across most children on a developmental timetable. That's what you can expect to see in terms of the progression of emotional development. Temperament does also have an emotional component, but unlike emotion, this is more about individual differences, that it's more about how the individual tends to react to varying situations. So it's about how reactive they are and also how good they are at regulating those reactions. So I guess a basic definition in your textbook is that it's a characteristic, disposition, or style of approaching and reacting to situations. And temperament, based on the research, appears to be it's early appearing, so you can distinguish children based on temperament very early on in the earliest months of life. It also tends to be a stable characteristic, fairly stable, especially early in development, meaning that children who display a certain temperament at one point in time will also continue to display that type of temperament later in time. So it's stable in terms of the individual differences in reactivity and also regulation. Now, there have been different schools of study on temperament. Thomas and Chess are the researchers that conducted the New York longitudinal study that's discussed in your textbook, and it's based on Thomas and Chess's research is where we see the different types of temperament, the 3 different types of temperament that we'll talk about in a second. But basically what they did is they followed 141 children from early infancy all the way into adulthood. And they measured several different types of behaviors and characteristics. So things like activity level, rhythmicity, distractibility, approach withdrawal, adaptability, attention span, intensity of reaction, threshold of responsiveness. So they're looking at things like, how active in general is a child, how easily do they get on a regular schedule, how easily do they respond to new situations, how easily do they adapt to change in situations, how intense are their typical emotional reactions, and how much stimulation do they need in order to react. And so looking at all of those different factors, they were able to categorize the 141 children according to some different types of temperament that we'll talk about in a second. A more recent school of thought on this is from Mary Rothbard's research. It's very similar. It's not a complete change in terms of philosophy, but it just kind of breaks down the important dimensions of temperament a little bit differently, so that you have 2 main dimensions. You have reactivity and you have self-regulation. Right, so under reactivity, you'll see some overlap between Thomas and Chess's and Rothbard's categories. So activity level, attention span, but Rothbard also looks at fearful distress and irritable distress, and also positive affect. And then a really important component, which you don't see as much in the Thomas and Chess approach, is self-regulation or effortful control. And that's the capacity to voluntarily suppress a dominant reactive response in order to plan and execute a more adaptive response. So we all sort of have a default, right, or sort of an automatic reaction that we might engage in response to certain situations. And someone who has good effortful control can kind of put the brakes on and say, wait a minute, is this the best reaction for this particular situation? If not, then I'm going to engage in thoughtful planning of an alternative response. So these are just the 2 different types of approaches. Now, in Thomas and Chess's model and in their research, what they found were these 3 different temperaments, these 3 different styles. On the one hand, you have easy children. 40%, the majority of the sample, fell into that category, and then you have difficult and slow to warm up children. And you notice that these percentages don't add up to 100%. So you'll have, anytime you try to categorize, humans, it's problematic because not everyone's going to fit neatly into a specific category. And so you're going to have a chunk of your sample that may not neatly fit. In this particular case, 35% of the children in Thomas and Chess's original study did not fit any of the patterns. Instead, they showed some kind of unique blend of the temperamental characteristics they were interested in. But they were interested in these three categories because there were across several children characteristics that just tended to cluster together to produce these temperamental types, and it described the majority of their sample. So easy children are those children that have in terms of rhythmicity, they quickly establish a routine in terms of eating and sleeping and those other bodily functions, okay? And their mood is generally cheerful. They tend to adapt easily to new experiences, right? So if you think about what a good baby is, that's what the easy category would be. Difficult children, only 10% of the sample. These are children that are very irregular in their daily routines. So in terms of that rhythmicity, they're slow to accept new experiences, and they tend to react negatively to situations. And when they react negatively, those reactions tend to be intense as well. And then you have your slow to warm up children. 15% of the sample. These children are not very physically active. So if you look at that activity category on the previous slide, they tend to show mild reactions to new stimuli. They tend to have more negative mood, and they tend to adjust slowly to new experiences. Okay, and so those are the different patterns. And we'll talk more about temperament in some different ways. Now, one of the dimensions that has been studied quite a bit and is thought to have a temperamental basis is whether you're shy or very sociable, right? And it's also referred to as being inhibited or uninhibited. And the studies on inhibition and inhibition really suggest that there's a biological basis to temperament. Okay, so people are really interested, for instance, in people that are outgoing or shy, because you can see specific patterns of behavior that are related to those two extremes. So, for instance, shy men tend to date, marry, and become fathers later in life than other men. Shy women tend to be more likely to become full-time homemakers rather than to pursue a career outside the home. Extroverts, on the other hand, tend to be more likely to get higher paying, stable management positions in leadership, right? So you see these different outcomes in association with temperament. Now, keep in mind that a lot of the research on shyness and sociability has been done with white American children, so we have to be concerned about how well this generalizes to other samples. And what we find in that research is that 25% of most samples are consistently sociable, 10% are consistently shy and emotionally uninhibited. So sociability is sort of what we see the majority of the time. Now, what's interesting is that this trait tends to manifest itself in the first months. It shows up very early as inhibition to unfamiliar experiences. Okay, so what we see is that those that are inhibited or shy, they tend to react very early in life in a negative way to new stimuli. They withdraw from new stimuli. They show different physiological patterns, so higher heart rates, more stress hormones, and stress symptoms in relation to new situations, and more right hemisphere frontal cortex activity, which is where negative emotion is housed. And then uninhibited sociable infants very early on tend to react more positively to new stimuli. They also show lower heart rates, lower stress hormones and stress symptoms in relation to new situations, and more activity in the left hemisphere, which is where positive emotion shows. One study in particular looked at 4-month-olds, and what they did is they videotaped them for 10 minutes as they reacted to several new toys, mobiles, and sounds. And they rated children on their overall motor activity, which included kicking, waving their arms, and also on crying. And they also looked at how quickly the child was soothed once they were crying. And they found that 23% of the infants were high in both motor activity and crying. 37% were low in both of those activities, and then the remaining 40% were high in one but not the other. And then at 14 months, they tested the infants again in a new situation. And one example of a new situation was that they were given something that looked unusual and asked them to taste it. Okay, and all of the children showed some wariness, which is good, that's adaptive, but some were more fearful than others. And what they found is that those that were high in motor activity and crying at 4 months of age were the ones that showed the most fearfulness in the new situation at 14 months of age. Okay, so you're actually seeing, remember, we said that 25% are consistently sociable, 10% are shy. So you're having fewer individuals shy than those that are sociable. Well, what we're finding in this study is that 23% of the infants were high in both activities, whereas 37% were low in both activities, right? So that's sort of the difference between inhibited and uninhibited. So you have fewer of your sample that is classified as inhibited, as noted by high motor activity, and those that are uninhibited, you have 30% of them, and they had lower motor activity and crying. Okay, so what this indicates, it shows up at 4 months of age, which means that it has a strong biological basis. And so shyness really isn't the fault of the individual, right? It's not something that they just can choose to be or not to be. It's something that has a strong biological basis and shows up early in infancy. What's interesting is that our society tends to prefer one type or the over the other, right? We tend to value individuals that are more sociable than those that are shy. And that's not the case in every society. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This chart also gives support to temperament having a biological basis. It's comparing identical twins to fraternal twins, and you have both researchers' ratings and parent ratings. And what you see, if you look at the correlations, or the correlation coefficients, those rated by researchers, identical twins are much more similar to each other. They have a higher correlation in terms of their temperament than the fraternal twins. And when parents rate, it's pretty remarkable because parents actually see the fraternal twins as being more different from each other than alike, right? That's why you have a negative correlation. Their scores are moving in opposite directions. And so parents don't even see their fraternal twins as being very much alike in temperament at all. So the fact that the identical twins who share 100% of their genes are rated more similarly by both researchers and parents indicates that perhaps there's something genetic, something biological underlying the temperament that we see early on. So heritability estimates would be at about 50% for temperament, indicating that genes are responsible for about half of the individual differences that we see in temperament, which of course we talked about before may be an overestimate, but in any case that means 50% is influenced by the environment. So how does the environment have an influence? Well, nutrition can play a role, for instance, in cases of extreme nutritional or emotional deprivation that can lead to maladaptive emotional reactivity. Caregiving definitely plays a role, right? So, how responsive is the parent to the child? How sensitive are they with the child? And we also see some cultural variation. For instance, what we see is that Asian babies tend to be more calm. They are less likely to become upset, and they're more easily soothed than American babies are, Caucasian American babies are. And if you look at parenting, there are some differences in the ways that Asian mothers and Caucasian mothers soothe their babies, and that can affect early temperament. Um, There are also some sex differences in temperament that are promoted by parents. So, parents tend to respond differently to male and female babies. They tend to be more encouraging of their infant sons being physically active. They tend to encourage daughters to seek help in physical closeness more often. And so, the environment can play a role in that. And then, the environment also plays a role in terms of something that is termed goodness of fit, right? Because it's looking at the combination of genetics and environment. What you're trying to do with goodness of fit is match the child's temperament to the child rearing that you offer. So that temperament and environment are working together to produce a favorable outcome, right? So children with difficult temperament, for instance, also tend to later in development have some difficult behaviors later in childhood. But if you look at the parenting of those children, those parents tend to be less sensitive in their responding. They tend to get more frustrated more easily, right? So here you see a gene environment correlation where the parenting is working with the child's temperament to produce this maladaptive outcome. But in goodness of fit, what you can strive for is responding in a way that meets with the child's limitations and their demands, so that developmental outcomes are good, right? If you have a poor fit between temperament and environment, then that's going to disrupt development. So one example is, let's say you have a slow to warm up child. Probably what you don't want to do is force them all the time into new situations, right? Because what that's going to do is it's going to exacerbate their tendency to be slow to warm up. And so you could, for instance, allow a slow to warm up child more time to adjust to a new situation, right? You make the new situations available, but you don't force them. You allow them time to adjust. And that's a way of working with their temperament in order to produce a favorable outcome.